Lessons can be learnt is a familiar phrase after adverse incidents. But what can be learnt from America's depression of the 30s? And how do they compare with Britain's recent recession? IEA TV caught up with Professor Forrest Cappy from the Cass Business School.
Friedman and Schwartz produced this monumental monetary history of the United States covering the period from the 1860s to the 1960s. And a principal chapter in that book was a focus on the Great Depression, the Great Contraction, as they called it. And they found in there that what they said was there was a normal downturn in the economy in 1929, but that was transformed into the Great Depression through the failure of the Federal Reserve. Money supply fell, there were bank failures, and at each of 2 or 3 points between 1930 and 33, the Federal Reserve failed to keep the money stock growing. They did pump some base money into the system, but not nearly enough as broad money collapsed. And they point the finger then very strongly at the Federal Reserve. It was their failure that transformed a normal downturn into the Great Depression. But they were careful to say that is certainly what it looks like. But they had other evidence, and it was bringing all the other evidence to bear that made their conclusion a bit firmer. And the other evidence was that in all the cyclical activity in the United States from the 1860s through, in major downturns, money had been the key factor. There were other downturns where they don't talk about money being necessarily central, but it was the major downturns, and this is the biggest downturn of all.
There have been many theories about the cause of the Great Depression. Which is correct?
Prior to the Friedman and Schwartz explanation, there were several explanations around. In fact, the first ones tended to be stories of an autonomous collapse of investment. A lot of focus was given to the stock market crash in late 1929, or that it was the coincidence of the troughs of all the economic cycles that there were. And so it went on. And these were the stories that persisted through the 40s and 50s until Friedman and Schwartz came along in the 60s and put the focus on money.
Does Friedman and Schwartz's work have any implication to the stock market crash of 2008?
I think if Friedman and Schwartz were around today, they would be reminding us of the experience of the Great Depression in particular. And that is that when there is a financial crisis and there's a fall, which is almost a definition of a crisis, a fall in the money supply, it's the responsibility of the central banks to pump sufficient money into the system to try and keep broad money on its path. Bernanke went out of his way at a dinner once to say to Friedman that they accepted guilt for the Great Depression, and they would never let that happen again. They certainly appear to have followed some of that path in the last few years, albeit like the Bank of England in the 19th century, a little bit hesitantly to begin with, and perhaps insufficiently in total. But Friedman and Schwartz would have recommended, I think, much of the path that has been taken, but perhaps introducing it a little bit more quickly and assuring the markets that that's what would happen.
One response to the crash has been to increase the capital requirements of banks and to tighten their requirements. How has this helped or hindered?
In the recent crisis, much as in the Great Depression, there clearly was a crisis. The authorities in time responded in much the way that they should have done, particularly perhaps in the United States, but also here. But it needn't have become a bigger crisis than it was, and it wouldn't have been, I would say, without the authorities stepping in to make things worse by raising capital requirements. Now, it seems extraordinary that if their ambition was to keep money growth up, they should introduce a regulation which would have the effect of dampening it down. And that appears to have been what they did. Apparently, if not oblivious, then they had explanations that are beyond the normal person's comprehension, because the effect of the higher capital requirements was clearly to slow money growth.
What is the benefit of the new regulations regarding how much capital banks hold?
In fact, this introduction of the regulation on capital seems to me to be entirely redundant. Indeed, it's damaging. But a far better path, I would suggest, would be to leave banks to decide on what their own capital requirements should be. I mean, I think that's the path that the British banking system took for well nigh 100 years. And they were robust institutions that people trusted entirely, and there was no fear of them failing. They might run into a liquidity problem at some stage, but certainly not a solvency problem where they were left to find their own capital ratio. And only the individual bank knew what kind of assets it was lending on. They do look similar across the British banking system, but they were different, and they did hold indeed different capital asset ratios. But only they can have a feel for what that should be. And if they are clearly going to fail, if they do make a mess of things, then that's surely the best incentive to keep things in order. If we are now on our way to a world where these institutions can fail, then I think that's definitely a step in the right direction.